Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another webinar from Philips Lighting University. Today's webinar is titled Lighting University, the Power of Light Going Beyond Illumination. And it will be presented to you by Brett Andersen. Brett is a principal designer at Focus Lighting who has collaborated with world-renowned design professionals in his career, blending architecture and light in unique ways that create memorable experiences. So without any further delay, I hand over to Brett.
I've been lucky enough to spend the last 30 years of my life doing what I love, which is doing what I call playing with light. I first experienced the power of light while working in high school theater, and then I studied theatrical lighting design throughout college and grad school. But when I moved to New York a little more than 20 years ago, I was ready to jump into the New York theater scene. But I got a call to come work on an architectural project. And I quickly learned that although I really enjoyed the theater experience, what I loved was lighting and using light to create a beautiful composition to show people where to look and to make them feel an emotion. And I guess if I'm being honest, that getting a predictable paycheck wasn't a bad thing either. So since then, I've been fortunate enough to work on probably hundreds of projects of all different kinds. Restaurants, hotels, office spaces and retail stores, landscapes and large exteriors, and a lot of fun and challenging special projects too. And I think what links these very different projects together is my desire to find creative ways to use the powers of light to shape how people perceive and experience the built environment. But over the years, I have to admit, I found myself surprised at just how little understanding there is for the incredible power of light. So today, I want to use this webinar to remind us all just how powerful light can really be. We'll start off by taking a look at some of the specific powers that light has. And then next, I'll speak about the requirement to build a visual library of all the different ways lighting can be used. Then I'll talk a little bit about an additional role I think all of us lighting designers should take on called the curator of the visual image. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about the lighting design process and how to make the most of what I think are the most important parts of that process, the beginning and the end. But first, I'd like to start off by reminding all of you of a simple but I think very underappreciated fact that is certainly central to everything we're going to discuss today, and also central to everything you perceive visually. And that is, all you see is light. You don't see the shapes of these stone columns. You don't see the texture of this peeling paint. And you don't see the rich color of these purple velvet chairs. What you see is the light that is reflected off of those objects into your eye, where that image is focused on your retina, where you have 130 million photoreceptor cells made up of mostly rods for low-level light and cones for short, medium, and long-wave light. And those rods and cones sense the light and then send signals via your fiber optic nerve to your brain, where it pieces together the image that you're seeing. So if all you ever see is light, then the quality of lighting used to light something will completely change how it's perceived, or if it's even perceived at all. And that's why it's so powerful. But light's power hasn't always been widely appreciated. For years, people haven't really thought of lighting as being so important. Lighting simply provided illumination. They weren't aware of the effect lighting could play on how they perceive something or how light made them feel. I mean, if you go back 30 years or more, at least in the United States, architects and interior designers in school often learned about lighting in the same class as other building systems like HVAC and plumbing and other electrical. These were all just building infrastructure, necessary evils that need to be coordinated so as not to disturb a building's design. Lighting was just doing its necessary job of illumination. I guess the good news is a lot has changed in recent years. Certainly the advancement of and widespread adoption of LEDs has been the biggest change to the lighting industry, certainly since the invention of the incandescent light bulb. And the advances LEDs bring also open doors to understanding and solving some of the light-related issues facing mankind, such as circadian rhythm disruption. And these solutions are finding their way into mainstream life. I mean, just look at the night shift feature found on iPhones. That feature alone helps inform the public just how much small changes in lighting can have positive effects in their daily life. And we can't forget about the internet. I mean, the truth is, people see much more than they did 30 years ago. Images of great design lit in really creative and memorable ways find their way onto millions of mobile phones every day. So not only has technology changed, but people are much more aware of the important role light plays in their daily lives. But the problem is, I'd be willing to wager a bet that most people, including some architects and interior designers, and even some people working in the lighting industry, can't really describe the specific ways light can alter their visual perception. So I thought, as a reminder, let's take a quick look at some of those powers of light. First, light is an amazing tool to direct the eye. Here are a couple examples. So in this first photo, we have very even lighting. All the architectural elements have very little contrast. They're kind of monochromatic. They're very similar values. So when you look at this photo with your eyes kind of wander around, sort of hunting for a focal point. Now here's the same image. Now we've added some lighting to create a couple spotlights and a bit of contrast. And so now your eye starts to know where to go. Maybe it focused on the photo above the fireplace. Maybe it focused on the right-hand couch where the floor lamp is lit. Light is also a great influence on how you perceive color. I'm sure you guys have all experienced this. Maybe you've put on makeup or some clothing in one type of light at home and then saw how different it looks when you got to work. Light has a huge influence on the colors that we actually see. But why is that? Now, I'm sure you remember from high school physics, white light is actually made up of all the colors of the rainbow. And you probably remember Roy G. Biv. The problem is, every light source, whether it's incandescent, fluorescent, high pressure sodium, all the different types of LEDs out there, and even daylight, they all emit a different range of these colors. So the light that they emit can make you perceive the same color object in very different ways. This sort of extreme example is probably something you guys have all experienced. So on the right, we've got a parking lot lit with high pressure sodium light fixtures. On the left, we have a parking lot lit with metal halide. On the right, you can see that the grass and the pavement is completely different color perceptually, but on the left, it looks very crisp and clean and white. And the only thing that's different is the lighting itself. The next power of light is texture. Light has an amazing ability to either enhance or totally eliminate texture. And the physics on this one are really quite simple. Texture is enhanced by contrast. Contrast is often made of light and shadow. So if you hold a light fixture and graze up a brick wall, the rough texture of the brick causes lots of little shadows to be created. But in contrast, if you pull that light source away from the same brick wall, all those little shadows get softened or maybe completely go away. And then the drama of the texture is totally gone. All this is simply caused by changing the location of the light fixture and the angle of the light. Light can also be used to hide or reveal details. Many years ago, when I was designing lighting for dance, I was always using light in ways that showcased the dancers, showed their expressions, the color of their costumes, the strength of their bodies. But I also learned that I could use light in ways that made all those details disappear and instead emphasize the beautiful forms that they were creating on stage. Again, nothing changed except the way in which the dancers were lit. And I think the last and maybe one of the most powerful powers of light is light's ability to help stir an emotion. And I think one of the very best examples of this is Fisher Moran Stone's Tribute in Light. Sadness, mourning, respect, thanks. The list of emotions this lighting conveys just goes on and on. I think it's an excellent example of just how powerful light can be to make you feel something. So lighting designers can harness all of these powers of light, and they can use them to enhance or maybe distort or even make elements within the built environment completely disappear. So not only is light powerful, the role of the lighting designer is also pretty powerful. But as you know, with power also comes responsibility. So if you're a young designer with this huge responsibility over how everything you're designing for is perceived, how do you prepare yourself to be able to make the very best recommendations? Well, certainly you need to learn the process and the craft of lighting design. And that includes, all the deliverables that you're going to have to create, like Photoshop renderings and CAD plans and details and a photometric model and cut sheets. But I'd actually argue the best way to ensure you're making the very best lighting recommendations is by spending as much time as possible playing with light. And when I first started designing lighting for theater, I really didn't know what I was doing. I had a very limited understanding of how lighting could influence a theatrical performance. So to get me to understand this, one of my first assignments was to literally experiment in a light lab with actual lights and different pieces of scenery and costumes draped over mannequins that kind of mimic the form of the actors on stage. I'd spent hours and hours trying different combinations of angles and colors, blending layers of lighting on top of one another to see how they looked. But I also spent a lot of time looking at what other theatrical lighting designers were doing. Now, this was all before the internet and Instagram, so my main resources were primarily books and magazines about theatrical design, in addition to going to actual shows. I'd find a moment captured in a photograph that I thought was really successful, and I'd break the lighting down in my mind. It's kind of analyzing what angle each layer of light was coming from. What color was it? How bright was it compared to all the others? Also, I could reverse engineer how the lighting designer had solved that particular design challenge. And this approach really helped me stretch my imagination on just how far you could push the use of light. But I started to think more critically about light, and I learned how light worked. I started to realize I didn't need to limit my observations to a dark light lab at 2 a.m, or with my nose buried in a pile of design magazines. Great examples of lighting were all around me, all day long. Whether it was the dappled sunlight filtering through a stand of oak trees, or the beautiful range of colors created on the horizon as the sun sets, or even how soft and kind of shadowless the fluorescent lighting was in my lecture hall. With each of these examples, I would take a moment to stop and really analyze what was going on with the lighting and the materials the light was bouncing off of. So all of these experiences, the hours playing with light and observing and analyzing how light was being used, they formed memories that became the beginning of a mental library of how light works. And this visual library is something I add to and draw against every day as a professional lighting designer. And I think this is really, really important. I believe that it's the visual library that allows a lighting designer to state as fact how a piece of architecture is going to look once it's lit. Because without this library, you're at best only stating your opinion of how it will look, which obviously isn't as strong or as informed. So if you're a student or a young lighting designer, you need to spend as many hours as you can playing with light. But how much? How much is enough? So in my opinion, you have to spend at least 1,000 hours. You have to put 1,000 hours under your belt before you can start working at a lighting design firm. Now, I know that probably sounds like a ton, but that's actually only 5 hours a week over the course of a 4-year college program. So the second thing you need to do is see as much design lighting as possible. And keep in mind, it's so much easier these days to see interesting design. A couple Google searches will yield you a number of great visual resources that are updated constantly, giving you kind of a daily source of lighting knowledge and inspiration. And the third thing you need to do is experience lighting with your own eyes. Look at light outside. Look at electric lighting. But stop and take a moment to look and analyze the lighting you're experiencing. How does it make you feel? Where does your eye go and why? Does the lighting help create compositions? How many layers of light are being used? What's the quality of light? And how much is it? How bright is the lighting? So once you've been armed with this visual library of how light works, of course, you'll be more capable of making the best lighting recommendations. But in my opinion, there's actually a more valuable contribution you can make with all this experience. And that's as what I call the curator of the visual image. So I'll tell you a story. A few years ago, I was having dinner with some people, and someone asked me what I did. And I said, oh, I'm a lighting designer for architecture. And he got a bit of a puzzled look on his face, and he said, what does that mean? And so I described how I use light to make sure that an architect's vision for a project gets realized. And he stopped and he thought about it for a minute, and he said, so you're kind of a curator. And so now it was my turn to be a little bit puzzled. And I answered, what do you mean? And he said, well, so you're not the artist, but you see where the artist is trying to get to. And you make sure his work is perceived the way it's intended to be perceived. Just like a curator that's putting together an art show. And I thought about it for a little while and kind of nodded and said, yeah, that's pretty much what I do. So after that dinner, I thought a lot about the idea of lighting designers being this curator. It's way more than just hanging art on a wall. It's knowing the artist. It's understanding their point of view. And it's figuring out how to show their work in a way that supports and enhances their vision. The truth is, most architects and interior designers haven't spent the same amount of time looking at and analyzing light. So it's much harder for them to correctly visualize how their design will look with lighting layered on top. In my experience, no one sees that final visual image of the design more clearly than the lighting designer. But before we can act as curator, we actually must fully understand what that architect or interior designer's vision is. Their goals, their priorities, what they want it to look like, feel like, where they want the viewer's eye to go. We need to spend a lot of time talking this through with them, looking at examples of other spaces, or even better, go experience spaces together to spark reaction and discussion. And once you understand their vision, the curator has two prime responsibilities, in addition to the normal lighting designer responsibilities. First, you've got to evaluate all the elements of the proposed design to understand if the design team is on target for delivering that image. Are there opportunities being missed? Maybe there are elements that put the visual image at risk. This evaluation is going to have to happen constantly. It happens throughout the entire design process. As the design evolves, you as the curator have to keep reevaluating. The next thing you have to do is you must take that information you get from those constant evaluations and report it back to the design team, at least to the architect and the interior designer, so that they can use that information and act on it and make any of the adjustments that are required. Let me give you a few examples of what the curator can actually contribute. We designed the lighting for Oriel Restaurant a number of years ago in New York City, and Charlie Palmer was the chef. And one of his goals was he wanted to be known for having the biggest wine collection in New York City. Well, the problem is there wasn't a lot of space to show this huge collection of wine. So Adam Tahani, the designer, came up with this brilliant idea of this quote, quote, wine cellar, which was actually over the top of the main bar and dining room. And if you cut a section through the room and looked up at the wine cellar, we started to notice that certainly you see the wine in the back, but you also had this really large amount of surface area, the ceiling at the top of this wine cellar, that really we were starting to think was a missed opportunity. So we started studying this, and we made a bit of a study model. This is a little scale model of that wine cellar. And we started playing with textures and colors like the warmth of roses, or maybe a little bit of water texture. Someone in our office came up with the idea of an infinity mirror. And then we turned off the lights in the infinity mirror and we were left with just mirror. And it was, as always, kind of the simplest solution is the most brilliant. And so this mirror allowed us to, because we were looking up at this wine cellar, essentially double the view of the wine. And so here's the finished wine cellar, and you can see on the roof of this space is a metallic mirrored panels. And when you view it from down below, it indeed does double the amount of wine that is seen up in this wine cellar. So another great example is the work that we did for 7 For All Mankind Soho store here in New York. And the goal in this was really to try to use lighting to increase foot traffic to come into the store. So we did a lot of the sort of expected things, like we lit these stairs, we put light behind the 7 For All Mankind signs at the top of the windows, we added extra lighting to the merchandising inside. All those things helped, but one of the things we started to realize is if you look at the before photo, which is on the left, and look at the glass, what you're actually seeing is a bright reflection of the building across the street. And so that reflection was actually keeping customers from seeing into the store. And so we looked at this and we started to realize, it's not really lighting, but it is affecting how the project is being perceived. And so we went to the ownership and we suggested that they invest the extra money in non-glare glass. So you see on the right, you can still see the same reflections on the upper windows as you saw on the left, but on the lower windows where the displays are, all of that is non-glare glass. And you don't get any of that reflection, you see right into the store. So another great example of something beyond lighting, but that is a really helpful thing for the curator to recommend. And now this last one is something I'm sure all lighting designers have had an issue with. Certainly we have. This is a residential project in New York that we were actually brought in to try to help fix at the end. But we always see this where you design an uplight ceiling cove and you convince the architect to use a matte finish, and you do the drawings, and then some number of months later, a junior architect decides, it'd be better if it was a shiny finish. And then you show up for the aiming, and suddenly the ceiling is ruined, and you see nothing but your light fixtures as opposed to the beautiful architecture. I mean, this is a problem that happens all the time, to the point where we actually made a bit of a tabletop cove mock-up that allowed us to actually carry this into architects' offices and use it as a tool to explain to the architects and the younger designers the difference between lighting a matte surface and a shiny surface. So it's these extra moves that many times these suggestions don't directly involve lighting, but they are the things that a lighting designer is acutely trained to see and consider. This is why taking on this additional role as curator can make you as a lighting designer a huge asset to your clients. So the last thing I'd like to talk about is the lighting design process itself. I always think of the process in 3 parts. Of course, the beginning, which I sort of think of as the foundation to the design. The middle, which is, I think, where the bulk of lighting work happens. You're picking light fixtures, you're doing cut sheets, you're doing documentation. And then the end, which is really the time for you to deliver the design that you've promised your client. But too often, for many reasons, lighting designers and lighting design firms focus way too much of their fee time, and I think their training time, on the middle part of our process, and not enough on what I regard as the far more important parts of our design, the beginning and the end. The moves we make as lighting designers at the very beginning and the very end of our process is what makes a lighting design really successful. So I want to walk you through how I structure the beginning of our projects. And that's actually made up of 3 steps. And the first step is to understand the goals of the owner and the goals of the architect. So I thought I would actually show an example project. This happens to be 1717 Broadway, which we designed. It's a high-rise hotel located in Manhattan. It's 68 stories tall, and we completed it a few years ago. We did the exterior lighting design for this project. So when you're starting to think about what are the goals and you want to ask the architect and the owner, it could be a lot of different things. It might be to stir an emotion. Maybe it's to create something that's memorable. It could be that you're looking to add a landmark onto a skyline. Maybe you're trying to do the opposite. Maybe you're trying to get your building to kind of disappear. Or perhaps you want it to look as good in 5 or 10 years as it does on day one, and you want it to have a timeless design. Or maybe the environment is important to you. Or perhaps you're selling really expensive hotel rooms or residential units, and you have an amazing view of Central Park. And the owner's main goal is they just don't want you as lighting designer to screw up that view. Or it could be as simple as they just want to have a return on investment. They just want to make money. It could be any of these things, and it might be more than one. But your job as a lighting designer is to get to the bottom of what motivates them to hire you and to spend all the money they're going to spend to light their building or their space. You've got to understand that in order to help deliver that. So the goals for 1717 Broadway, we actually had the owner come into our office as well as the architect, and we asked him this question. And he thought about it for a second, and what he said was, Brett, I want your help to put my thumbprint on the skyline of Manhattan. Now, I have to admit, that was pretty cool. I'd never heard anyone say that before. But, my team and I, we were sort of thinking about this, and it wasn't incredibly descriptive. It didn't really give us a lot of direction design-wise. So we started asking a lot of questions, trying to dig into this a little bit. What we got to is that ultimately what he wanted was to make his building memorable. He wanted people who visited New York, who lived in New York, to look up and see it and tell other people about it. That was his goal. So once we understood that, we then set out to analyze the project. That's step 2. And we started this project like we start almost all of our projects. We think about what we call the primary views. And for this, we used a couple of tools. We used SketchUp and Google Earth. We built the model of the building. That's the little yellow building on the skyline there. And then we dropped it into Google Earth, which allowed us to literally walk around the city virtually and kind of pick and choose the really important views that we felt represented how people were going to experience our lighting design. And, we looked at things like the view from Times Square, which obviously there's a lot of sort of visual chaos going on there. But we also had the opposite, this view from Central Park, which was much more serene. So we then can take these primary views and not only identify where they are, but also start to think about how far away are they. And so, if you're going to view something a mile away, you might choose a different light source than you would if you're only viewing it from a couple blocks away. And the last thing we do is prioritize these. So number 1 is the view across the river. That's the best view of the skyline. So it makes sense that would be the number 1 primary view. Number 2 is the guest's first experience when they get out of the cab and look up at the building. And then we have 3 from Times Square and 4 from Central Park. So once we've completed this analysis on the primary views, then we use those views to kind of think about, all right, what competition are we going to be up against visually in each of these? So we took photographs and we studied sort of the skyline as it was when we designed it. And one of the things we noticed is that, other than the Empire State Building, there wasn't a huge use of color, a few buildings here and there. But for the most part, a lot of the buildings in New York skyline were lit with white light. We also looked at the close view and the Times Square view. Obviously, again, lots of sort of visual noise that we had to compete with. We had to figure out a way to contrast ourselves with all this advertising, but not so much that we really disturbed this quite serene view from Central Park. So now our third thing that we analyzed was, how do we accomplish the goal? How do we really make this design memorable? And to do that, we actually looked at a whole bunch of different buildings from around the world. I think it was over 100 different buildings. And what we were looking for was common traits amongst these buildings that we felt made them memorable. And what we identified were 8 things. Unfortunately, only the first 5 really didn't apply to 1717. So what we were left with were the last 3, which were brightness, color contrast, and a dynamic look, something that was changing over time. And we felt that if we created a design that embodied these three characteristics, we'd be able to achieve the goal of creating a design and a building that would be memorable. So we've analyzed these three things, but a project can analyze a number of different things. Maybe you also want to take a look at the client's competition. Maybe you want to study the history of the owner or his company, or maybe the history of the city that you're designing in. You might want to analyze the different materials and the finishes that the architect chooses, or look at similar buildings and how they were lit and how they were built. Or you want to look at future development and what's coming. This is what we did for an exterior design, but there might be a whole new list of analysis that you would do for an interior space. There really is no end to what you can analyze. And the whole point of this is that you gather as much information as you possibly can to help feed and make decisions about your future design work. So the last step, now that we've known the goals and done the analysis, is agree on what I call a central concept. And there's a lot of discussion about, what is a concept? What does it mean? And to me, it's really simple. It's anything that can convey the essence of an intended design. Could be a piece of music, could be a piece of art, could be a description or a few words. So the question is, why do you need one of these? Why do you push a central concept? And my answer is, it gets and keeps everyone on the design team heading in the same direction. Imagine an architect with an idea heading one direction, and then an owner with a different idea heading a different direction, and then a lighting designer going another way. The chances of all three of those people actually getting to the right spot and the same spot are pretty slim. And so if you have a central concept that you agree upon, that's the direction that everyone's going in. And it greatly raises the chance of your design being successful. Another reason I like coming up and getting agreement on this concept is it avoids the arbitrary decisions that happen. When you're faced with option A for lighting or option B, and you need to make a choice, which one do you choose? Well, which one best supports the central concept? That's the one you should go with if you can. And the last thing is, don't forget, pushing is not enough. You actually must get agreement. You've got to talk through what the concept is. People have to believe it. It can't just be lip service. Yeah, I know what the concept is. You actually have to buy into the fact that this is where we're going. Without that, it's not as effective as it needs to be. So if we jump back to 1717, what were the concepts that we came up with? We all sat down as a team and we started thinking about the analysis and the goals, and the ideas that came up were, first, we remembered that view from the skyline, the lack of color. And so we thought, maybe we should just choose one color. We'll make it blue. It also helped that the owner's favorite color was blue. Of course, we wanted it to be timeless, which also kind of means that it's ever-changing, which worked with the dynamic facade that we had learned in our research. Obviously, it wants to be unique. And we started thinking about that Times Square view and that Central Park view. And the Times Square, is surrounded by advertising. But what if we contrasted ourselves by doing something not advertising, but more artistic? And could we then use that as kind of a gift to the city? Which that started to work with that Central Park view. And then someone in the office said, really, the crown is what you see from most of those primary views. So really, why don't we do this by treating the crown as a canvas? And then it hit us. That really, when we talk about 1717, we're talking about a gallery in the sky. Something that is dynamic, that is beautiful, that is changing over time, and that is a gift to the city, and that is memorable. And that's what we were able to create. And we did it by starting our process, by understanding the goal, doing all that analysis work, and then really thinking about and driving home that lighting concept. So we talked about the beginning of the process, but now I want to jump to the end, the other really important part. For lighting, the final moments of the design process are where either it all comes together or it all falls apart. And let's say you're designing the lighting for a beautiful restaurant. You can do all the steps we've been talking about since the beginning. You have an amazing design concept that everyone's bought into. You can develop a creative design, and you can document it perfectly. But if you don't get it built correctly, or worse, the aiming or the dimming levels don't get done with care, you're not going to be able to deliver what you promised as a lighting designer. Now, why is this? Well, the powers of light require really precise actions to be effective. For example, correctly positioning track heads to correspond perfectly with these architectural panels. Or maybe carefully aiming an accent to draw your eye to a focal point at the end of a corridor. Or using different optical accessories like color filters and spread lenses that allow you to manipulate the color of the light to create contrast and texture. Or using the control system to set the light levels and to create the desired visual composition that the design team has been thinking. The transformation that happens when a well-trained lighting designer conducts what I call the aim and adjust is often, well, to use a lighting metaphor, like night and day. The problem is that transformation almost always happens at the most chaotic moment of the project, right before a project opens. There's so much that can foil a great lighting design at that very moment. Construction delays, maybe it's fixtures that aren't installed correctly, could be a control system that isn't commissioned by the time you show up. Maybe they lost all of your optical accessories. Maybe the circuiting is incorrect. Maybe you can't get any actual dark time in the space. You can't really see what the space is going to look like at night. Maybe they forgot to order the ladders or lifts. Or worse, you have really slow electricians. Or the owner is frankly just unwilling to pay for your travel expenses and have you come out and do it because he doesn't think it's that important. Or maybe you didn't reserve enough feet and time to actually do the aim and adjust correctly. I think maybe the worst sin yet is walking into an aim and adjust and not having a game plan. So if you're a lighting designer, what do you do to avoid this? How do you guarantee success at this critical junction of your design? Well, a few things. First, when you propose the project way back at the beginning, make sure you allow enough fee and time to actually do the job right at the end. How much time? Pretty much a rule of thumb is double what you think it's going to take, because that's pretty normal. Obviously, educate your clients. Spend some time making them appreciate all that work. It's not just going on, turning some lights on and walking out the door. There's a lot of work that goes into making those lights and the compositions that everyone's been talking about look great. Obviously, the fixture submittals that you get from any suppliers, you have to review them. That is the heart of your design, and you have to fight for the things that are really important to the success of your design. Obviously, if the fixtures aren't installed correctly, you're going to have problems, so you've got to follow the construction progress really closely. And one of my big rules is don't assume anything. The only thing you can assume is that if you aren't involved, something is going to go wrong. Obviously, you have to have a plan, and you should review it with everyone, not just the one guy that's letting you onto the job site or the electrician, but you should talk to the architect, you should talk to the owner, you should talk to the electrician and the general contractor, and you should tell them all what the plan is so that you can reveal any problems that might come up beforehand. And this is the most chaotic time of the job. So if you get some information from someone, it might be right or it might not. So what I do is I call multiple people and I average the information. And that way you can make the best decisions. You should request great electricians. And if you don't get them, send them back and ask for different ones. You have limited amount of time on site. You need to move fast. And one of the last things is make sure the controls are working great when you leave. That's really what you leave your owner with. He's going to touch those buttons, and if they frustrate him every single time, he's not going to remember how beautiful the lighting is. He's going to be frustrated at you for not working out those controls. And the last thing to remember is at the aim and adjust, you have to agonize over every detail and every decision. This is where it all comes together. Push yourself to do really great work at this time in the job. It will be worth it. So we've talked about a lot today. So I want to put together a number of takeaways to sort of summarize what you should remember. So if you're a student or a young designer listening to this, play with light. 5 hours a week. It's not that much, but it's going to teach you so much about how light works and how it interacts with finishes and materials. And anywhere you go, analyze the light that you see. In a restaurant, outside, at your parents' house, you have to constantly be looking and thinking about light so you can build that visual memory. If you're a practicing lighting designer, keep analyzing and playing with light. It's really important that you keep that up and you keep that memory and that library fresh with new ideas. And start thinking of yourself as the curator of the visual image. There's more than just lighting that you can add as a lighting designer. You see things because of your visual memory that other people can't see. Use that power to make yourself a bigger resource in your client's mind. If you run a lighting design firm, raise the bar. Start early. Have enough fees so that you can do the great foundational work at the beginning of your design, and your people can have enough time to do the best job they can at the end of the project. And give your younger designers opportunities to be educated. Don't just sit them at a desk and have them do CAD and photometrics all day long. Have them spend 5 hours a week with a light fixture in their hand. They need to learn. They need to keep growing as designers. If you're an architect or an interior designer, think of lighting as more than just illumination. There is so much more light can do to help you achieve your vision of your design. And part of that is you have to trust your lighting designer. So search for one you trust and then push them to be your creator or your curator so that they can help you achieve your goals. And last, if you're an owner or developer, keep remembering, all you see is light. So the next time you sit down and there's a lot of pressure to VE that light, think about that, because those light fixtures that your lighting designer specified, that creates everything that you and your customers see. Next, you want to make sure you have a constant dialogue with your lighting designer. Keep talking with them. It's really important. It helps the lighting designer understand where you're coming from. Don't just have it be once at the beginning and when you hire them and once at the end. You should talk to them at least once a month, if not more. And the last thing is, help them have a successful end to their process. They need time to make your job look great. Make sure that the construction gets done on time and that the electricians are available so that they can do their job to really make your job sing. And speaking of ends, that would be the end of this webinar. So thank you very much for listening and joining us.